Next up, we have Connor Ryan, who is the Rhododendron Collections Manager at Holden Forests and Gardens. And he's an Eastern U.S. Regional Rhododendron Coordinator for Botanical Gardens Conservation International. Today, Mr. Ryan will be telling us about historic rhododendron breeding at the David G. Leach Station and future prospects. The floor is yours, Mr. Ryan.
Thanks, Juliana. Really excited to be here. It is now 8:30, which is nice because when we started the meeting, it was 7 a.m. So it's, I think I'm awake now. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so what I want to do is just kind of give a retrospective on our breeding program at Holden Forests and Gardens, and I'm trying to cover like 50 years, so I think I'm just going to zip right into it. So I work for Holden Forests and Gardens along with Juliana, and Holden Forests and Gardens is quite an enterprise in Northeast Ohio in the United States. The number seems to change, but I'm going to go with we're the 12th largest public garden in the United States by area, and that's mostly because we have a large amount of natural areas, about 3,000 acres, but we also have about 60 acres of rhododendron gardens. So we're quite committed to this group. And those gardens are really housed at two places, the Holden Arboretum and the David G. Leach Research Station. We also have a third campus that's actually in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. Just to give some perspective for the international audience. Here we are in Ohio. We're just south of Lake Erie, which is the smallest of the Great Lakes. Summers here can get quite hot, around 35 C, 95 Fahrenheit, and winters on occasion can get very cold, maybe negative 30 C, negative 20 Fahrenheit. So we're dealing with a tricky climate here. And our breeding program really started with the late David G. Leach, who was an eminent horticulturist originally from Western Pennsylvania in the United States. He wrote the book on rhododendrons, Rhododendron of the World, published in 1961, which is still a useful text, though it's a bit outdated now. And he was just obsessed with rhododendrons and started breeding them in Pennsylvania. And then in 1970, decided to move to Northeast Ohio and proceeded to move his whole rhododendron collection from Pennsylvania to Ohio. And then in the 80s, gifted his rhododendron breeding program to Holden Arboretum to really jumpstart our research program. And we're in a very cold part of the world, and so David's focus was really on cold hardiness. First and foremost, it was cold hardiness, and we use hardiness zones in the United States. So his goal was really zone 5, which is negative 18 Fahrenheit, negative 28 Celsius, and that means that the plants will flower reliably after winters that reach those temperatures. In addition to that, he was really interested in adding colors that don't exist in cold hardy rhododendrons to his plants. And then he also wanted them to be superior to plants on the market, which is a bit gray. But those were his 3 standards. And when we talk about cold hardiness in species, there aren't really a lot to pick from when we're talking about zone 5 cold hardiness. We look at Rhododendron aureum, Brachycarpum, Rhododendron catabiense, Tigronianum maximum, Oreodoxa. And these are all zone 5 hardy, but when you look at their flowers, their trusses, they're all basically white, off-white, or pink. You might say catabiense is a lavender in color, but you don't really have a lot of interesting flower colors. And so David really took it upon himself to add those colors. And so you have to really cross a cold hardy species with a species that's not so cold hardy to get those colors. So for example, this is David's Samoa, which gets its red color from Rhododendron forestii. And this is Butler port, which gets purple from Rhododendron ponicum. And this is Vinecrest that gets yellow from Rhododendron wardii. None of those plants we can really grow outside long-term here in Northeast Ohio. And he was really interested in oranges and yellows above anything else, and got orange and yellow from a selection called Fabia, and there are others too, but they get this orange from Rhododendron dichroanthum. And he would cross this with cold hardy rhododendrons, particularly the white flower version of our native Rhododendron catabiense. He would also use a selection called Russell Harmon, which is a naturally occurring hybrid between 2 of our native rhododendrons. But that was really the foundation of Leach's program, and you can find most of these one of these three and almost all of his hybrids. Just to give you a little selection of what he's created. Here's Edmund Amadeus, which is actually named after the illustrator of his book. Swansdown, which is just a fine white. Summer Glow, which blooms in summer, actually a few weeks after our peak rhododendron bloom. Bravo with an exclamation point, which I love because it's like he's patting himself on the back. Singapore and Samoa, which are true reds for his own 5, which is hard to come by, especially in his time. More complex colors like Rio, Blaze and Sun, and Janet Blair, where you have more than one color in the truss and the flowers. And maybe his crowning achievement, which is Capistrano, which is a fully cold hardy zone 5 yellow flowered rhododendron. And with a bit of hindsight, looking at his hybrids, they're all exceptionally cold hardy, all colorful, but they have some major flaws. We see a lot of necrosis on their leaves. It's just a common poor leaf retention, which I think is usually correlated with poor health. And that's because his rhododendrons tend to be pretty challenging to grow. We suffer from root rot quite often. And so that brings us to the next stage in this cycle, which we like to call the Krebs Cycle, because after David Leach was Dr. Stephen Krebs, who overlapped with David for about 6 years before David passed. And Steve really took the flaws of the Leach hybrids to heart and incorporated 2 different things in his breeding program. One is replicated trials, because a lot of what David did was just grow a plant at his research station, decided he liked it, and then named it and introduced it. He didn't really do a lot of vetting, trying it in different places. And so we now evaluate at the Leach station. We also evaluate at the Holden Arboretum, and on occasion we evaluate in southern Louisiana as well. And then he also incorporated disease resistance, especially root rot resistance, which Gene Burns talked about a little yesterday. Root rot is a chronic problem for rhododendrons. It's an oomycete disease that produces spores that have flagella and can move around in water, and they colonize roots, eventually make their way to the crown, clog the vasculature, and you end up with a permanently wilted plant like this one. It's a chronic problem for people who grow rhododendrons, and those people have experienced a little bit of root rot at some point in their cultivation experience. And so we've been screening seedling populations where we take beds, dig out holes, put seedling populations in these beds. We know that the disease is present in this bed, and then we'll flood it, because flooding encourages the disease to produce spores. And over time, we see some fallout, and we say these green plants are likely resistant, and we'll pot them and save them for ornamental evaluations. And there are a lot of sources of resistance. The program initially started using cultivars for resistance breeding. And there are several sources. Caroline is maybe the most famous root rot resistant rhododendron, but we've used Rocket with good success, Normandy, others like Crete, Disca, Ingrid Melquist, Samoa, and Vernus. And we've gotten promising results using these resistant parents, Normandy, Rocket, Rio, Rocket, and Disca. The challenge with using these cultivars is that we don't really know where what the source of resistance is. We just know it's a cultivar that's resistant. We don't know what genes control the resistance. It's a lot of guesswork. And when you make crosses, say you make a cross using a highly resistant parent, or you make a cross using a moderately resistant parent, sometimes the progeny are more resistant using the moderately resistant parent than using the highly resistant parent. And so we can make progress, but it's a little bit unpredictable, especially since we don't use a lot of genomic and genetic resources in our breeding program. And so we really needed something else. Just as a side note, maybe the best source of resistance is a cultivar called Ingrid Melquist, which was developed in Connecticut. And it's a great plant in itself, but when crossed with plants like we crossed this with a Leach hybrid called Rio and got these great hybrids. Very compact, amazing trusses, grow in full sun, grow in shade, root rot resistant, really a great, and that resistance seems to reliably carry through. But we really needed something else. And so this is where rhododendron hyperrhythm enters the story. And interestingly enough, in the 80s and 90s, a veterinarian of all people started trying to grow rhododendrons in Louisiana. And Louisiana is not a place that I would ever want to try to grow a rhododendron. But John Thornton was obsessed and decided he needed to grow rhododendrons. And he tried all kinds of cultivars and species and found that Hyperethrum and its hybrids really thrived in Louisiana. And so here's where we are. This is Louisiana, almost on the Gulf Coast. Very hot, very humid all the time. Not the type of climate you'd want to grow rhododendron in, and yet they survive down there with rhododendron hyperethrum. And so it's and that kind of gave us a clue that there might be it might be resistant, or it might have some kind of adaptability benefit. The plant in itself is pretty great on its own, very floriferous with these pink buds fading to white. Dark green leaves. The leaves are a bit curled, which I think is kind of a neutral trait, but that does carry through to the first generation. And they are, so here's a figure that from Steve Krebs's work, where he screened open pollinated seedlings of Capistrano, which is a known susceptible, seedlings from Rhododendron hyperethrum, which is assumed to be resistant, and then the hybrid between the two. These were all exposed to the root rot pathogen. And over time, nearly all of the Capistrano open pollinated seedlings died. About 25% of the hyperethrum seedlings died, and about 50% of the first generation hybrid between the two survived. And so that was a pretty good indication that we can use this to pass on resistance in our breeding program. And here are some of the first generation hybrids that we got. In general, the trusses weren't exceptional. The flowers, the petals tend to be thin. They tend to flop over, but there were some standouts. And often the color saturation wasn't great either. But the best of the bunch, this is Steve with his Splendor, was named and introduced to the commercial market. It's a really great tough plant. And now we're on to the first back cross generation, because we found out that the first generation of hyperethrum crosses ended up not being fully cold hardy for us. And so we're having to add cold hardiness and hopefully add some more ornamental traits along the way by back crossing. And these are just starting to bloom now. These are all selections, nearly all of them are selections that I made this year. But we're excited about these. And with a bit of hindsight, Steve Krebs is retired as of last year. We've still got his plants in the field, so I don't know if we're at the end of the Krebs cycle, but near the end of the Krebs cycle. But most of its hybrids are compact, which is, I think, good for a homeowner, but tricky with the nursery industry because they want something that grows fast. And compact doesn't always mean it grows fast. The first generation hyperethrum hybrids have fantastic foliage, really great, and usually clean too. The trusses are okay, but not exceptional. And it turns out that they're not as cold hardy as we had hoped. They also tend to be slow to propagate, which is fine if we have a tissue culture introducer. But I think the nursery industry would be reluctant to use them because they take months and months to develop even some roots. And they're not ironclads, which I'll talk about in a second. And so what's next for us is taking these first generation backcross selections, getting some good performance evaluations of them, getting some hardiness trials, which is actually becoming harder with climate change because we don't get the cold winters that we used to here. I think also something that our hybrids needs is multiple seasons of interest, because I think rhododendrons are in some ways being left in the dust, especially in our area, because reblooming is becoming a thing. Plants have all of these interesting leaf traits, and most of our rhododendrons bloom in spring and it's amazing, and then they just become boring landscape plants. So I think we need to try to incorporate multiple seasons of interest. And then actually there's an emerging Phytophthora recently described that, at least in Oregon in the United States, is becoming more prevalent in nurseries than the Phytophthora cinnamomi that we've been screening for. And so the question is, do we have the resistance that do we have resistance to this new Phytophthora, or are we going to have to try to breed for an additional Phytophthora? And the other question is Phytophthora plurivora in Ohio? So that's an emerging problem that we're going to have to work with. And then the other thing that we need to address is the elephant in the room, and that's that, at least in the eastern United States, nursery growers are really only interested in growing the ironclad rhododendron. So we've got 50 years of breeding here in Ohio, and the industry isn't super receptive to any of our new hybrids. They just want to grow these centuries-old hybrids developed in England that are all basically hybrids between Rhododendron guttaviense and Rhododendron panicum. And so the question is, do our hybrids hold up compared to these ironclad varieties, or do we need to start trying to improve the ironclads instead of trying to do our own thing like we've done over the last 50 years? So with that, I think I'm right on 15 minutes. Our research station has an exceptional breeders collection of rhododendrons that we're trying to encourage people to use for activities besides breeding. So if you're interested in talking about potentially using our collection or our facilities, you can look at my poster in the poster session, or feel free to reach out. With that, I think I'll take questions.
Thank you, Connor. Even though we work together and I know what you do, I always have fun and I feel like I always learn something new. So great talk.
I like just showing all the pretty pictures.
You know, it's nice. It's a nice break. You have a question. Claudia
Okay.
Briggs asks, this may be a naive question, but how can you protect a patent when growing outdoors?
Let's see. Well, let's see. So a patent lasts for 20 years, and I mean, I guess the way you protect a patent is that you only license your plant to certain people. Well, I guess that's what a patent allows you to do.
Is this a pollen transfer issue really, or is that maybe Claudia's asking because of pollen moving around?
Yeah, if I may say, yes, exactly. That is the question. So how can you really be sure that you protect your patent or you protect the plant and the plant is not sort of spreading, right? I mean, there will be birds, there will be different intruders of the normal environment, right, to spread it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not fully understanding.
Yeah, I think that relates to the question that we discussed before, when we talked about how can you breed plants probably indoors, like with these smaller shoots that Matthias showed, right? Or how can you compare that to outdoors breeding? And so when you patent something, I understand that you need to really know precisely what your features are and what the properties of the plants are and so on, and it cannot change over time, right? Whereas when you breed it outdoors, then you don't have that under control, right? Because you have different environmental stresses, and there will be spreading of pollen and so on.
Sure. So I guess you're saying that a plant that you grow outdoors has different traits depending on the environment that's growing in, and so when you have a patent on it, how do you know that it's the plant that you say it is?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well. To be honest, the plant patent process in the United States is a bit of a joke. I know over in Europe, you guys have plant breeders' rights, and you have to submit plants for trials. And here, you just collect a bunch of, it seems like, arbitrary data and submit it to the plant patent office, and they say, "Okay, looks good," and then they give you a patent. And it's you don't have to submit samples or anything. And so I don't know. I guess I don't know of an instance where someone's had to take someone to court to address violating a patent, but it is an interesting question, because essentially we just we say, okay, this is this color, the leaves are this length when we measured it, but yes, of course, there's a lot of phenotypic plasticity going on. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Probably we're scratching our heads too much here, also on these formalities, right? Like the jurisdiction, we have to fill out forms and whatnot. But that's probably a European trait. Thank you.
Just a comment there. When I go to Germany, when I eat chocolate, it's always delicious, and American chocolate varies widely. So I'm going to say that there are some great things about these strict rules for what is this? This is chocolate, not some random chocolatey thing that's not really chocolate. So I think that's really interesting to hear about the two different perspectives from the different countries. I have a question for you about resistance versus tolerance. So this is a question I have been asked about Holden's Phytophthora resistant. So do you guys have any indications of resistance versus tolerance in the hybrids that you're making?
Yeah, that's a legitimate question. And, you know, we don't have any, like, we don't know what genes are controlling this. We don't know. What I would say is that that when we do like Phytophthora screens, usually what we'll do is look at the roots, and if the roots become like really brown, then we know that they're infected by the. And when you have resistant, well, what we're calling resistant plants, the roots don't even turn brown. With something with tolerance, you'd expect to see a lot of brown roots, but then maybe some new white roots that are emerging too. So that's about what we've got for why we think it's resistance and not tolerance.
Right. It's interesting because just like with Matthias Ulrich's work, there's so much to be done. It's almost like you could cast about in a sea of breeding for your entire life. And I love seeing the perspective on a breeding program and saying, well, this was great, but these things did not work. I think that's the heart of great breeding, is you're going to make, learn some lessons and move forward. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think the industry has really changed since David Leach's time. And so I think the last 20 years have been kind of this like limbo. It's like, well, is it going to go back to the way David had it, or is it going to keep going to this narrower pool of plants that people are growing? And it just seems to stay narrower and narrower.
Yeah, well, because the big box stores, I can buy a rhododendron Holden at Lowe's every year. And they might even be the same plants that they bring out year after year until they get sold. But they'll live in that pot. I have a question. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the kinds of research that you would invite at Leach? What do you think Leach Station is really good to investigate?
Sure. Yeah. So we have this, it's like 1,400 plants in the collection plus countless field selections. So we have to get an inventory on, really. But there's pedigreed hybrids that have so many different species in their background. And I think there's interesting questions to answer about, speciation. Hybridization leads to speciation. And so you could look at how all of these genomes are working together. I think there's certainly, with the research doesn't have to benefit the breeding program, but low-hanging fruit would be, what genes are conferring resistance, how many of them are there, where are they located in the genome? I don't know. There's so many different options, and with climate change tilt, I think that's becoming an issue with. I think it's going to be harder and harder for us to grow rhododendrons here, because we already have the root rot problem, and we're going to have these heavy rains that's going to encourage the root rot disease, but then we're also going to have long droughts. I think looking at this collection and seeing how these different species in the backgrounds of all these hybrids might contribute to some of these traits, root rot resistance, drought tolerance, cold, in light of a changing climate, I think is there too. And then what I would also say is that so we have this breeders collection, but as a curator of the rhododendron collection at Holden, we're really trying to emphasize species collection, and the collection at the Leach Station and the site itself is exceptional for growing rhododendrons, because the soil is sand. And when you read about growing garden plants, they always say you want a moist, well-drained soil, and we really have that at the station. So it's an opportunity to grow a lot of species that we couldn't grow elsewhere in Ohio and even the eastern United States. And so I think we're going to have a growing and enticing species collection in addition to this great pedigreed hybrid collection.
That's great. Is just looking back at the mention of the Nagoya protocols. So Leach's collection, does it come in under the 1991 line?
Nagoya is tricky with the United States, because technically we don't have to follow it because we didn't sign it. And so we like to say that we're operating in the spirit of it, but technically we're not breaking any rules by just going to China and taking seeds. It's tricky.
But it might be coming, so maybe we want to prepare for that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you, Connor.